Welcome to the next episode of Brandland. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by Liz Brown, who's the CMO at Little League International. Liz, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Garrett. Thanks for having me today.
Well, it's so great to have you on the show. I'm super excited to dive into our topic today. I think most everyone out there is familiar with the Little League, especially if you're from the United States. Either you have played or participated in the past, or you have a friend or a relative who's done that. So I'm excited to kind of dive in and understand, what this experience has been like for you specifically in the last year or so. The Little League has gone through this brand refresh or this rebrand. So excited to dive into that. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your career and what the scope of Little League International entails? Because I know it's more than just the local leagues, right?
Sure, absolutely. So maybe I'll start there, and then I'll give you a quick background of my previous experiences. So I am the CMO of Little League International, as you mentioned, and that Little League International is the governing body for Little League programs around the world. So we do have a very large foothold in the US, but we're also in over 80 countries as well. So when you hear Little League and youth baseball, we're sort of the Kleenex of youth sports in some ways, and especially youth baseball and softball. In my role at Little League, I oversee the marketing and communications departments, which includes all of our partnerships, sponsorships, license relationships, our retail team, as well as the communication side, which is digital, social, the website, and so forth. So it's really this project that we're going to talk about and sort of the refresh of our brand was really in the wheelhouse of our entire group and what we do on a regular basis. Real quick on my background, I started in the agency world, events and experiential marketing, promotions, and then into kind of the sponsorship consultant landscape, really evaluating sponsorships on a large and small scale for some really top brands. So moving into Little League 11 years ago now, taking all that great experience and then transitioning into the role now. I would also note our organization and our team as well is sort of heavily involved in the oversight and management of our Little League World Series tournament. So when you hear local league play and community play, and then you hear the summer of Little League World Series, that is something that's falling under our organization's purview too.
That's fascinating. I think what's so interesting about that to me is, the Little League is such an iconic brand. So many people have heard of the Little League, but you often don't think of the business side behind that brand. It's one of those brands that you just don't think about. And I think there's so many aspects to that, as you just described. I mean, there's a retail aspect to that and partnerships, and there's big events like the Little League World Series, in addition to kind of the coordination of that at the local level for all the leagues. So I know that there's probably so much that goes into that, and we'll probably only have time to scratch the surface today, but we're super excited to have you on the show. And again, just to kind of frame that topic, as you and I kind of discussed this, you went through this rebrand this last year, and today we want to talk through what that experience was like. And so we can extract some of those learnings that you had along the way and share those with our listeners. Does that sound all right?
Oh, that sounds great. Happy to do so.
Well, let's jump in. I think, really just to set the stage here, I'd like to talk through, first that discovery process. So when was it that you felt like a rebrand was necessary?
Yeah, I would say it was sort of a bubbling up process. And again, I've been at Little League for 11 years or so, and, had looked at our style guide and our materials, maybe more on the business side to start with. So, a licensee would produce a product with a mark on it, or we would be having a sponsorship discussion and presenting, the opportunity from a business side. And just there was something about that process that we felt like we were missing. The way the brand was being represented, or the way that it looked on a certain product that we may be exploring. And then I would say, over my tenure, getting more involved in the communication side, the tone, the messaging, the things we were saying, we felt like we were having a lot of conversations about reworking things, whether it was the message or even the way the logo would appear on certain materials that we were creating. We just felt like we were missing the mark. And it wasn't something we could put our finger on for a while, but it sort of bubbled up, and it became this, I think we need to do a brand identity project sort of notion, probably 3 or 4 years ago. And so, I think to your point earlier, we never really looked at ourselves as a brand. And I think even that word right now is still hard for us to label Little League as a brand. But
Hmm.
when you talk about what people know and the awareness level, and you speak in sort of brand metrics and attributes, the things that are measured by brands on a regular basis, we fit all the marks, right?
Hmm.
So the discovery process, I would say, and the bubbling up for the need of the project was sort of a culmination of a lot of these learnings that we said, I think we need to embark on this project and begin somewhere to see if it can't be solved with some sort of consistency.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What I'm curious about too is, it's such an iconic brand. It's interesting hearing you say that, initially you might not have thought of yourselves as a brand, even though it is such an iconic brand that people recognize. Um, because of that, though, and the history that's behind that, was that kind of a scary thing to kind of discover, hey, we might need to actually change this logo, which is how long had that previous logo been there?
Um, there was a suite of logos we used. One of them
Yeah.
had been around for a very long time, multiple decades. The others, 20, 30 years. So yes, dated in some ways, had maybe had some modern updates to them along the way, but definitely the idea of losing our heritage, our history, our legacy as a part of this process was a reason not to do it, and
Hmm.
sort of met with resistance along the way. Um, and some questioning of what is it that we're looking to do.
Yeah.
Definitely was a part of that process.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So that kind of takes me to my next question is then what are some of the most important things that you and your team did during this initial discovery phase? Because of that history, it sounds like
Yep.
there's probably, a lot of stakeholder buy-in that you had to do across the org, but what else happened during that phase?
So I think that I would start with we had to find the right partner. So we framed up the problem. I sort of say problem in quotations
Mhm.
that and some of that problem was defined by looking at our audiences a little bit more, right? So as youth sports is changing and parents are changing and what they're looking for is changing, like we're changing along with it, right? We're
Mhm.
innovating and we're being creative and modernizing ourselves, and we needed to be able to say that. And so that was sort of framing this problem of, we can say it not only with words and our exposure on ESPN through our tournaments, but we need to say it differently through what the brand looks like and how we are represented. So we needed to find the right group to help us do that. I would say none of us felt like we were experts in house to lead this project. We
Mhm.
needed an expert on the outside. And so we did an RFP process. We ended up with a fantastic brand agency called Ology out of Ohio, who had a lot of similar experiences in the educational side of branding. And so they just brought this expertise to the table that gave us confidence, frankly, that we were looking at this project in the right way. Stakeholder buy-in, as you mentioned, was huge. I mean, we are governed by a board of directors. We have a senior leadership team. And then frankly, just all employees' voices are important, right? And you needed
Mhm.
to get buy-in that I understand what you're doing, and I am going to be a part of this process when it comes to, my seat to implement. And so the employee piece I can talk about in a little bit was a really big one. And then, I think just again, knowing who your audiences are. And part of this process and the expertise that our brand agency brought to the table was helping us distill more of who our audiences were, so that we were thinking about the creative side, which came frankly much later in the process. We would be able to speak to each audience in the way that would resonate with them. And so I don't think I don't think any of that is an overrated thought, right? You need to spend the time on audience development and analysis in order to make sure you're trying to hit the mark with each one. And so when I say audience for Little League, that is our volunteers to start with. And we are a volunteer run organization, 6,500 leagues or so with over 1 million volunteers. And so those are our sales force, right? They're the ones that are
Mhm.
implementing our program. They're giving the experience to players every year. And so we need to give them tools to tell the story of what Little League is in a really consistent way. And back to the discovery phase, which you sort of asked about, I think discovery is so important. And I often think when brands are thinking about the project, discovery feels like, well, why would I pay for that? Like, that's
Mhm.
something we should just know. But that is where you uncover what all the things you need to work on are. And, our project definitely evolved in discovery. But the audience piece and identifying it and then figuring out where to focus the messaging, the creative on those different audiences over time was a huge piece of that phase, and one that I would not. I'm glad we never sort of skipped or minimized the importance of in the process, because it's really what led to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's so crucial. I think any marketer or creative who's gone through a rebrand or even a refresh knows that and has seen that initial planning and preparation phase where you're doing so much of that research is so crucial, right? What I'm hearing you say is, you have this history and understand the climate of, the organization, and that have that internal knowledge, and you partner that with, this agency who you decided to work with, who had the framework and the expertise in how do you go deeper in some of this research, how do you frame it and how you set it up. And then that sets the stage for then what you produce down the road. So often that work is the bulk of that importance of that work is done in that, I think, that pre-planning stage before you actually get in the execution, because then you actually have kind of that yardstick for judging whether something's successful as you're ideating later on, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah,
And it
it's
also
fascinating.
creates the connection, right? So especially when you're working with somebody outside or even the team internally. I mean, when we sat in some of our discovery sessions, we had members of finance, we had members of legal, we had obviously our president and CEO, operations, people that maybe aren't living and breathing marketing and communications every day. And so they felt connected to helping identify areas of importance, and even we laid out creative opportunities in front of them and let them pick on things that they gravitated towards, or they were sort of feeling would represent the Little League voice. And so I just think it's a unique way to sort of bring people together too in the process around the initiative, and not just hand them, here's the new brand book, go
Yeah.
follow it. They felt like they were a part of building what we were doing as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think so one thing I want to ask about, just follow up on, is I think that there's, when you think about stakeholder buy-in, there's obviously, like you said, the board of directors and some of that senior leadership, but you talked also about employees. And I know we might get to that later on. So employees
Mhm.
and volunteers, what was the process like for, especially in that discovery phase, helping frame the problem for everyone else across the org and why you were kind of embarking on this journey?
Well, I would start with maybe one thing that came out of discovery, and I think it's important to note before I sort of touch on your question, is that, we went into this thinking we needed a brand refresh. And during the discovery phase, realized it was so much more about messaging, mission statement,
Hmm.
value statements, and framing those pieces up as a part of this process. And so when we had the meetings, and they were in person at the time, which was great because you could really bring people in. We also involved our regional offices by phone, because they, live and breathe this brand every day. Is taking everyone through the same type of question session, right? So when we were uncovering like what are the challenges we're going to go through with this process, or like, so for example, one of the things that was uncovered in discovery was our current sort of brand and messaging didn't represent the fun that Little League is. That was really important. Little League is about having fun and everybody
Mm-hmm.
participating. And we got really stale, right, with it. We were very kind of with a business tone at times. And so letting each group, even though some of them were more on a meeting cadence versus everyone being on the phone at the same time or in the meeting, everyone kind of came to the same conclusions. So that discovery process of asking a lot of employees and involving a lot of them and making them feel like their voice was heard, and then seeing that wrapped into what the finished product was, I think was a huge piece of getting this project to the finish line, or to the starting line, I should say, because we're
Yeah.
still we're still running.
Yeah. Well, that's so good. And I think that, that's, as you explain that, I think that there's probably so much more work behind that 30 seconds, that you just described that. And I think that that's why a lot of times marketers are scared to go there or scared to bring other people into this process. But like you mentioned, I think it's so crucial for getting that buy-in, for helping ensure that it's something that people are going to take forward once you launch later on. I'm also really happy, that context that you provided about you went into this thinking maybe that it was just going to be refreshing the visual identity of your brand. I think so often, one thing I feel really passionate about is so often when people talk about branding, they think about just that visual identity or the logo, especially if they don't have the background or context in marketing or branding. But, like what you mentioned is so key, that a brand is so much more than that. It entails that vision, that mission, how you're messaging that to the world, as well as that visual expression of that. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that any great brand has that stuff locked in. It's more than just the visual expression or the logo.
Yep. And I would note, Garrett, too, that this whole project was paralleling an initiative we're still working on in creating a new strategic plan. So as we were changing and evolving and setting priorities, to have the brand be changing and evolving at the same time actually was a perfect timeline.
Yeah.
I don't know that we could have wished it any other way. I don't know that we went into it that way, but that is what the end result was. And I think that was really helpful to really bring the mission and some of those value statements and the messaging along for the ride too.
Yeah. I mean, that building that strong brand is so aligned with often business strategy, right? And the product or service you're putting out there to the world and everything. So yeah, that makes total sense. So I think we have a good understanding then of like a little bit of what this discovery phase looked like as you kind of moved into the next phase, where you had gotten this buy-in, you had your partner, you were then moving into this evolution of this project as it went forward and what that brand development looked like. Tell us a little bit more about that. What were some of the most important considerations that you went into that phase with as you began to develop the new brand?
Mm-hmm. I would say number one was not to do it in a vacuum. So we sort of came out of the discovery with a lot of input, right? And very quickly realized, number one, this was a much bigger project for a very small team that was kind of probably a side project with everything else we do on a regular basis. So we established a much broader branding team that had members of not only marketing and communications, purchasing, because there's so much of the products and the things that were going to be created that we needed to consider signs and signage and things. And then, frankly, the communication along the way, as we were sort of making progress, we wouldn't say we got the logo done quickly, but the look and feel and where we were going was one of the first things we were able to sort of get everybody to check the box on. From there, a lot of the other elements, and we've taken it, into the Little League World Series, our marks for that, signs on site, how we're going to be rebranding over time and so forth. We took each of those steps along the way up to senior leadership, at times to the board, and to the employee groups to review again. One of the most important things we did, which was about 6 months to 9 months before we actually did the launch, before we sort of also went into the shift with the pandemic, is we did what we called a brand open house, which was in our building, and we printed a number of creative pieces that were going to go into production. We set up a whole conference room, frankly, all of us dressed up in our new colors. Like, it was just a way to say, hey, remember we talked about this? Here's where we are. We want to give you kind of an update on what our plans are looking like, and come in and ask us questions. And in some ways, poke some holes in what you're seeing too, because it would be relevant to the information we were going to send out to our volunteers. We want to know if you see things that we're missing. And so it was another way to just like, hey, remember this project we talked to you about? Let's reconnect on it 6 months later so you can see the progress we've made, and you can again feel like you're connected to what's coming in the future.
I love that. I think that that's such an excellent example of internal marketing and bringing the organization along. Again, went back to what you talked about in that initial discovery phase of helping people understand, hey, this is what we're starting to work on, then giving them an opportunity for input. It makes so much sense that, eventually when you get to that phase of launching the brand, they're going to feel so much more bought into that. Like it's, part of their ideas that were incorporated. And that's really one of the keys to ensuring then at that point that you can launch successfully and maintain that consistent brand with, all the employees, all the volunteers going forward. So
Yep.
love that example.
One thing coming out of that too, real quick. So we're going to talk about One Team, One Little League in a minute, but that was sort of one of the copy points that we were promoting in the beginning. We made these little cards for everybody with the new mission statement on it and the One Team, One Little League saying. We didn't put the logo on because we hadn't released it yet. We were a little cautious about how much we sort of let that out of our purview. But walking around the office and seeing those cards like stuck on people's doors or the bins near their door and things like that, where you sort of said to yourself, okay, it was good to do this. It sort of validated the need to have that session that we had.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's so great. So tell me a little bit more too about, you said you arrived at that logo pretty quickly, but I mean, there's all of those other aspects of the messaging and how you're going to roll this out that I think were probably part of that brand development. Then you take into consideration again, the legacy of this brand and this organization and how long it's been around. So how did you incorporate that and the history into, the visual expression, the messaging, and other components of this brand in that development process?
So I hope I don't make it out to be that it was easy, because it wasn't.
Yeah.
I think some things were happening simultaneously as we were reviewing logo options and designs. We were also working on the messaging, but it came down to storytelling. And again, working with Ology, our agency, and our really great team of communications and marketing experts in-house, crafting the story and the rationale, which is sort of the business case that you talked about, and then leading into, this is what our new story is going to sound like. The story of Little League is for everyone, and the messaging that supported that, and then leaning then into what the new brand was going to look like. So we collectively took it in a full presentation approach. So we set up the rationale, we explain what the new story is, we explain what the new look and feel is, and then we showed the new look and feel on all types of creative. So you could really understand, okay, I get it. We had video in there too. We have a great video team in-house and working with the group who created the story in a dynamic way through video too, which all of that was really important so that you can not only see how the new logo is going to look, but you can see how it's going to play out in everything we do. And so, whether or not we've tweaked some of that since then, we have, but to know that you could visualize it beyond just a flat image on a piece of paper was really important. And then wrap the story around it too.
Yeah, I love that too, because I think that especially when you're not living and breathing this all day long, you're not in marketing, when you're someone out there who might be on the front lines, maybe a volunteer, the thing that you remember is not necessarily the specific rules from the brand book, right? But the story that goes along with it. So when you have that compelling story, that's something easy for people to internalize that is then that expression of the brand. So I'm so glad that you highlighted that.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit more, again, going back to the core of Little League is you have all of these volunteers at a grassroots level. So when you're in that development stage and you're thinking about, okay, when we launch this at some point, how are we going to help those volunteers, especially, to humanize and kind of localize that brand and express it still consistently, but in their own way at that level? Like, tell me about the thought process in terms of, in that development stage, what did that look like?
Well, the good thing is we have a lot of mechanisms for our volunteers to communicate with us and give us feedback or ask questions. And so we had started really cataloging over the years the types of requests we were getting for brand use or adjustments or applications. And so we had that in our wheelhouse already in the discovery phase. And then when we were really landing on when we were going to be launching and how we were going to launch, we started to sort of tease it out. And so I'll just use in the beginning of 2020, when everybody was still traveling, we were traveling too. We were going out and doing these big volunteer events with some of our kind of highest level volunteers, which we call our district administrators. And so a portion of the presentation that I gave at these meetings was talking about this brand launch coming and what it was going to look like and what it would mean for them. And, sort of saying, we know you're going to have a lot of questions. You can ask them now, or you can ask me after, but making sure they had a way to get in touch with us and share that information. We made this incredible video that took the logo and animated it and created some really great excitement with music and everything. And then didn't show them any of it, just kind of teased them with, here's a line here and a line here. Wait till June 6th when we're going to tell you what it is. So again, I think you have to get any constituent group excited, but especially volunteers, because the last thing you want to do is make it harder on them. Mm-hmm. Think about yourself or myself giving up your time after your normal work day to do this type of role for your community. We want this to feel really easy, and we want you to be excited about it. So that was all part of the opportunity to connect with volunteers along the way and make sure they were informed, excited, they knew it was coming, and that they would hopefully engage with it after the launch.
It makes total sense. So I guess if you were to sum up, these first two phases where you had this kind of discovery phase, then you kind of moved into the development of that new brand and bringing people along. How would you summarize your biggest learnings from that kind of those pre-launch phases? What are the biggest takeaways or learnings as you reflect on that experience?
So I think number one, don't always assume that everyone is going to understand what we're trying to do, right? So having the patience, the sort of steadfastness to bring people in and explain why it's important. And you might have to do that a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Over the course of the discovery and the sort of planning phase. I think once you can start to see the development come to life, also sharing that, because that's what gets people excited, right? The discovery phase, which we talked about, sometimes you're asking people to spend their time on something they maybe aren't normally doing. And it's important, but when you start to see the messaging changing, the brand shaping up, the creative coming together, and you can say, here's where we are. What do you think? Mm-hmm. I think people really start to understand more about what you're trying to do. So, look, this was a process. It took a while. And you have to also have that patience too, that it's not going to be something you're going to be able to do overnight. If you're going to do it well, and I'm not sort of patting ourselves on the back, but I do think we took the right amount of time and spent the right amount of energy on making sure that we were really thinking things through, which is very, very important when you're changing a brand like Little League.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hearing you talk about this, one of the things that stands out to me, hearing this experience in that those pre-launch phases, is how much you've talked about today and how much time and effort was put into exactly what you just said, bringing people along, helping frame the problem and why we're doing this, getting the stakeholder buy-in all the way down to like the grassroots level and helping people be bought in. I think that so often when companies embark on a rebrand or refresh for the first time, their thought process is so much about the visual expression of this and a handful of creatives in a room just banging out really cool ideas. But that's important, right? And that needs to happen at some point. But even more important is, I think what you just highlighted, is bringing everyone along, getting that buy-in, which again, I think helps set the stage for having a successful brand launch and future expression of that brand and maintaining consistency. Hi, everyone. This is Garrett Justice, the host of Brandland. We had such a great conversation with Liz Brown for this episode, and I just did not want it to stop. So we actually decided to do something unique this time and split this episode into two different episodes. It's going to be a 2-part series. So as we wrap up here, I think there's a lot of great learnings you can take away from part 1 that we just listened to. But I'd encourage you, if you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Liz, tune into next week where you can hear her talk even more about what the process was like for her to launch this brand, what the post-launch looked like, as well as some of the learnings that and advice that she would give herself if she could go back in time and talk to herself right before she launched this rebrand about a year ago for Little League International. So again, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and hope to have you tune in next week to hear the second half. Thanks.